Hello and welcome to today's virtual Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name's Rachel Myrow, senior editor of KQED's Silicon Valley News Desk. It's my great pleasure today to introduce our guest, Byron Tao, author of Means of Control: How the Hidden Alliance of Tech and Government is Creating a New American Surveillance State. Byron is an investigative journalist who specializes in law, courts, and national security. Currently, he reports and teaches at the All-Britain Journalism Institute, a nonprofit launched last year to train and mentor early career reporters. A reminder to our audience, we'll be taking your questions and encourage you to submit them in the YouTube chat. Byron, welcome. I am so thrilled to have you here. And let me just start off by saying thank you for writing this book.
Of course, thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, I think, in 2024, many people are vaguely aware that advertisers are tracking us. Fewer people might be aware that advertisers are buying tracking data from brokers and aggregators who buy it from the many websites and apps we visit that collect and maintain information about us. But even fewer people might be aware that U.S. intelligence agencies, the military, even local police departments without a warrant are collecting information about us. Can you just bring us up to speed? What kind of data are we talking about?
Sure. So essentially, at the heart of this story are data brokers, and those can be companies that collect anything from very basic sort of demographic and address information all the way up through very obscure, strange sets of data, like vacuuming up all the Bluetooth headphones or wireless base stations that a device sees in the world. There are also data brokers that broker social media data. There are data brokers that broker the data and the movement of phones or cars through the world. And so there's just a wide array of information that is currently out there and available for sale, some from giant consumer-oriented data brokers with names that maybe people have heard of, like LexisNexis or Thomson Reuters, all the way through very obscure, tiny, unknown data brokers with almost no public presence, many of which specialize in working with government entities, not just in the United States, but around the world. And so this entire world that's being described in this book is not the world that most people think of when they think of tech. It's not really about Facebook or Apple or Google. It's about this world of data brokers and data aggregators that are in a position to collect large amounts of data on the global population and resell it to entities, not just companies, but government entities.
To quote the old song, Byron, how long has this been going on?
It's a good question. So the traditional data broker came out of the 1960s, essentially. There were companies that sprung up to vacuum up information that was in the phone book or was down at the public courthouse, like marriage records and other things like that. And they were largely doing very simple address histories, a little bit of consumer preferences. So sometimes they would start to acquire things like magazine subscriber lists, right? And from a magazine, you might be able to infer something about a consumer. Did the consumer subscribe to Golf Digest or Dog Fancy? And what did that say about them as a consumer and what they wanted to hear from companies? But as things really got digitized at the beginning of the 20th century, the amount of data about all of us exploded. And so increasingly, you saw large-scale data sets about what was being said on public-facing social media sites like Instagram or like Twitter. Eventually, data brokers sprung up to collect data on the movement of cars or phones and track, what they would call anonymized, but we'll probably get into this. It's very difficult to anonymize location. And then eventually there got to be interest in these weird wireless data sets, and data brokers emerged to collect that kind of information. So it really is a wide array of information, everything from your address history, your property records, all the way up through things like where you go in the world.
I think many of us can imagine that U.S. government agencies might have some interest in some of this information if we were criminal suspects, if we were travelers crossing borders, especially national and international borders. But this is happening to a lot of people, or is a better way of putting it, to say this is happening to everybody?
Yeah, so this is what I would call bulk surveillance, right? So I think we understand that if you're suspected of a crime, if you're a criminal under investigation and the police have reason to look into you, they can go to a judge, they can get a warrant, they can look through your emails, they can go to your cell phone carrier and see where you've been. We put a check on that, right? We put courts in between investigators and citizen privacy. But when it comes to data brokers, because the information has been vacuumed up by a private company, because that private company is making it available in the commercial marketplace, all of a sudden, governments have figured out that large amounts of information is available on the public, not just the American public, but the global public, and it can be purchased, and it can be purchased in bulk. So sometimes these data sets contain the records of hundreds of millions or sometimes even billions of people. And that data can be deployed for whatever mission the government is undertaking at the moment. So for a while it was counterterrorism, but increasingly we're seeing it for things like border security and immigration enforcement, criminal law enforcement, and increasingly things like counterintelligence and curbing the threat from states like Russia and China. So this data is valuable, governments buy it, and they use it for whatever mission is important to them at the time.
It's interesting you mentioned Russia and China. I would imagine that this kind of behavior from those governments is, of course, legal because they say it's legal. But how is it legal here in the U.S.?
Right. So, because generally speaking, courts have taken the position that you need to have some privacy interest in the information in order for the Fourth Amendment, which is basically our strongest privacy protection from government intrusion, you need to have some privacy interest to protect before the Constitution is going to kick in. But the problem is, the court said back in the 1970s that if you give a little bit of information to a third party, you've actually lost that privacy interest in the information, right? So originally this came up in the context of things like the phone numbers you dialed, not the content of the phone call, but which phone numbers you dialed, or information about banking, right? You do have to tell the bank who you want to send the money to. You have to show them the check, it gets cashed, and that's how we do banking, right? So courts said, well, you've given this information to the bank, you've given the number you'd like to dial to the telephone company, you've actually lost your privacy interest in it. So governments don't really need a warrant to get that kind of information. It doesn't rise to the level of Fourth Amendment protection because you've shared it with a third party. And that potentially made sense in the 1970s when we were only sharing a limited amount of information with third parties. But today, to basically do anything in modern life, you really do need to give a tremendous amount of information over to who knows what third parties, right? To use your email, you're probably giving information to a half dozen, if not more, third parties, right? Your internet service provider and the local server and a DNS server and all sorts of entities are in a position to collect your information when you move around on the internet. And so this doctrine, this idea that because you've given this information to a third party, you've lost your privacy interest in it, has carried over into the world of data brokers. And by and large, lawyers have taken the position and courts have generally not really weighed in on a lot of the programs I write about in this book, that because it's a commercial transaction, because a consumer's already given their information to a third party, they don't really have any more privacy interest in it.
And that's even though, and I mean, it just boggles the mind. As you're just pointing out, I might go, say, to Capital One's website and share with them the, banking info I need to share in order to do banking. But that doesn't mean that I'm consciously aware of or interested in having any third party company have access to that information. Whether they're just kind of piggybacking on the transaction or they've got some kind of commercial arrangement with the bank.
Right. And this is really the problem with the world I describe in the book, right? Because consumers are aware they have some business to business or consumer to business relationship with a company like Capital One. But what they may not know is that in Capital One's app or on their website that there are third-party companies that put cookies there or trackers. In other kinds of apps like games, there are these third-party companies that sit there and collect location. And of course, there's advertisers that put banner ads on these websites and in these apps, and those advertisers are in a position to collect tremendous amounts of information. And so there are all these business relationships now that exist between entities in the online space, whether websites or services or apps, and they have a huge array of business relationships that the average consumer really has no insight into. And potentially there are clauses in the privacy policy that nobody ever reads. But this is the modern world that all these corporations trade data, they sell data, and they partner with other companies to help collect information. And the consumer cannot really be sure unless, they are very diligent about reading privacy policies. And even then, it's very difficult to tell. They can never really be sure where their information is going.
Among a number of bombshells in this book, Means of Control, you tell us the US government is not just a client of data brokers, but a strategic investor.
Yeah, so a lot of these very specialized data brokers that sprung up to provide products to the government actually got seed money from various research arms associated with the Pentagon or the Central Intelligence Agency. And of course, that makes sense, right? Because data is this vast commodity, an incredible way to understand the world in many cases, and can provide tremendous insights into things that governments are very, very interested in. And so in a number of these instances, the CIA's venture capital arm, In-Q-Tel, made some investments. There are some defense affiliated research funds and sort of affiliated think tanks that made strategic investments. And, these companies spring up, generate a commercial product for the commercial market, but often there's a government arm or a government affiliated investment fund that would like to provide them some funding. And as a result, they become drawn into this world of government data brokers, government intelligence tools. And so that's something that I saw over and over again in doing the research for this book, that the government or some affiliates of government entities would come forward with a large amount of investing money, and companies would take it because, often sometimes they were struggling, sometimes they were early stage companies, sometimes they were just interested in working with the government. And the government makes these strategic investments in technology and data, just like your average VC fund.
So we've talked about the fact that this has been going on for quite a few years, and to surprisingly little protest from the public, which leads me to my next question. Even though I might not, personally feel aligned with it, but what do you say to people who say, Byron, why should we care? If I'm not doing anything illegal, why does it really matter to me if everybody gets to sniff my digital trail?
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly reasonable question. I'd say a couple of things. First is that I think in the United States, the basic social bargain is that we do limit government power by limiting the amount of access to information that the government has. And potentially we are in the process of renegotiating that bargain as we speak. But I do think it's important for citizens in a democratic country to understand A, what their government is doing with technology, and B, what their consumer technology is doing, even if the social norms are changing to the point where potentially people don't really care that much if governments are acquiring a large amount of data. Second, I do think some of these programs were predicated on this notion of either that consumers had opted in to these data sharing agreements, or that the data that was being shared was what these brokers called anonymized. And if you dig deep into that, it's clear that neither one of those things is true, right? Consumers aren't really told at the point of collection that potentially a government entity could be lurking in the background and collecting information about them, right? If you read privacy policies, they generally say, we might collect this for advertising or analytics. It makes a lot of noise about commercial purposes. On the an anonymity point, if you have a data set, especially like geolocation, right, that's very hard to anonymize. So, for many years, I lived in a 13-unit apartment building. I worked at the Wall Street Journal and in the Washington Bureau. I was the only person getting up every day and biking from my home in Columbia Heights to downtown Washington at the Wall Street Journal's bureau. Even if you have a data set that didn't have my name in it, you could probably pick me out of this crowd just based on knowing a couple of things about me. So it's not really true that data sets like geolocation are anonymized. The final thing I would say is that whatever our government can do with data, other governments can do. So we're a democracy. Generally speaking, we have the rule of law and strong institutions that are meant to protect civil liberties and privacy. But there are authoritarian governments out there who are trying to reach across borders and punish dissidents and visit consequences on to the families of internal dissenters or so there are concerns about transnational repression that do come up when you're talking about huge amounts of data being available on the global population, and that could impact the privacy of people in the United States who potentially migrated from somewhere more repressive. Could also impact the safety of our soldiers or, our first responders, right? Like there, at one point doing this reporting, I actually found a data broker that was willing to give me a data set that showed the movement of U.S. troops in and out of Syria. I could see where they went home. That is a capability that an adversary could take advantage of if they wanted to.
So, not to put too fine a point on it, but we are doing and when I say we, American government agencies, American companies are doing the exact same thing that we accuse our international adversaries of doing.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's important to recognize that the United States pursues different aims than China or Russia, right? We are not perhaps morally equivalent, but all governments have become interested in understanding the world, and data is a way to understand the world. And so, of course, all governments are eager to acquire this kind of data, and any one of our sophisticated rivals can do essentially the same thing that I describe in this book. It's easier for me as an American reporter sitting in Washington, D.C. to report on the United States government, but it's no exaggeration to say that whatever I'm describing in this book can be done by China, can be done by Russia, can be done by North Korea. Those are just closed societies, and they're much harder for me as an outsider to penetrate.
So, it's no secret to you, and I believe everyone in our audience, that Congress has been slow walking, and that would be a generous term, any legislation having to do with tech in the modern age. But have you seen in your reporting any philosophical differences between the political parties as it pertains to privacy? Does it matter whether Republicans or Democrats control the White House?
It's a very good question. I actually think that on privacy and civil liberties issues, there are bipartisan or cross-partisan coalitions that are interested in some sort of reform. So Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon has long been a privacy champion. I write a fair amount about him in the book, and he, I believe in 2020 or 2021, put forward this proposal called the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act, which would essentially ban U.S. government entities from buying data on U.S. government or U.S. citizens or people in the United States. And that bill actually attracted a fair amount of bipartisan support from firebrand conservative Republicans like Jim Jordan. In fact, it came up for a vote last summer in the Judiciary Committee, and it passed 30-0. So there are sometimes these bipartisan coalitions that form, but Congress really, there's a lot of inertia. There's a lot of pushback from intelligence agencies. And let's not forget that, so much of this data collection underwrites the modern internet, right? So many consumers have come to expect getting things for free. And to unwind this whole advertising data collection ecosystem, that's probably a $1 trillion economic model. And to unwind it is a huge economic project that will not be easy. And so there are legitimate concerns about disrupting the internet, the way we get content on the internet too much in Washington. And I think that's, generally speaking, why we haven't seen a tremendous amount of action from our lawmakers on this topic.
You've seen regulators like Lena Khan over at the US FTC saying, that's okay. It would be nice to have federal legislation, modernizing the laws. But what we've got on the books, we can use to go after bad actors. We can do that today. And they do seem to be going after, industry control, market control, that's had a very long time to percolate. Um, do you think we need new federal legislation to get a hold of this consumer privacy surveillance economy?
Well, I certainly think the FTC has been acting fairly aggressively to crack down on what they say is bad behavior. Some of these companies probably would disagree that they're engaged in bad behavior, but we have seen increasingly a very activist FEC go after companies on data privacy issues. But I think if you're talking about sort of unwinding a lot of the things I write about in my book, I do think it would probably require some of this data to stop flowing to these brokers. And that probably takes a decision from an entity with a lot of power. That is potentially the government, right? You could see a government move to crack down on the collection of data about its citizens and its transfers. But there are also other entities that have a lot of power in this world. And namely, I'm thinking of Apple and Google. They write a lot of the rules about what you can collect from billions of devices around the world. And changes they have made to their technical infrastructure have actually resulted in changes in the amount of data that various entities can collect. And so it is possible that you would staunch the flow of some of the data to these data brokers by Apple and Google making changes to their system. But it's going to take some sort of entity with a lot of power and scale to really change what I've written about. Because once this data gets collected, the government actually has a fairly strong argument to be able to use it, right? Because the government will then say, well, this is data that Home Depot can buy to target ads, right? This is data that Walmart can use to sell children's toys. And our national security mission, solving crimes, that is much more important than selling patio furniture or selling toys. And so they argue about any sort of restriction on their use of data that is simply out there and is commercially available. And to some degree, that is a reasonable point.
Let's just go back and talk about Google and Apple, the two main flavors, the red pill, the blue pill, of the world that we live in today. Is there a substantial difference between the two when it comes to privacy, or is it just that Apple says it's keeping it more of an eagle eye on your privacy than Google?
Yeah, so it's a good question. In my reporting, I have found that Apple is a more difficult ecosystem to collect information off of, especially after 2021, 2022. Apple made some substantial changes to iOS, and now there are very clear notifications to consumers and consistent reminders when an app is collecting location in the background. And, I think companies have found that if you actually give consumers a choice and a lot of notice, like, hey, this game has collected your location 800 times, most of them are like, I don't really want that, and turn it off. So Apple has made some changes to its architecture. I think Google is also moving in that direction. I think they're moving towards some changes to Chrome and targeted advertising. And so I think both of these companies, to some degree, are responding to consumer discomfort and in some cases anger about data collection. But in general, both companies are in different businesses, right? Like Apple does make a lot more money selling hardware than Google. Google is a more data-oriented business. Apple does use data, of course, in some of its operations, but I think it can actually afford to be a little bit more privacy focused than a company like Google, which really is in the business of targeted advertising and personalization.
It does seem like every company is an advertising company these days, which is why we're having the conversation we're having. So here's another question for you. It's been true for a few years now that California has stronger privacy laws than the rest of the nation. But does it make any difference in practical terms, in terms of protecting our privacy? Now as a result, people all over the world are clicking on that box that says, these are the cookies I'm happy with. These are the ones I'll accept. These are the ones really no, don't. And but it's unclear to me whether that's really protecting me or it's just like a little fig leaf that these
Yeah,
companies are
so
using.
It's a great question. I did a little bit of reporting, and this is a few years old because it took a while to write this book, but I did a little bit of reporting to try to understand if both the California privacy law, CCPA, and the European privacy law called GDPR could potentially shed some light on the way data flows through this ecosystem. And by and large, I found the answer was no, right? That I enlisted some California residents who made some requests under the CCPA to some of these data brokers that work with governments, and they got nothing back, even though the data broker acknowledged having data on the person I recruited, who was a colleague of mine at the Wall Street Journal. And a team of Norwegian reporters did the same thing in Europe, and they did not get much back. And so, if you're just talking about allowing consumers to look at the data that's collected about them, I would say that as of 2 years ago, both of those laws were not particularly successful. And I also think it's clear that neither has really impacted the ability of companies to collect large amounts of data. Now, I know that California has a new enforcement agency that it's come up as part of the law. I know that certain countries in Europe have data protection authorities that are being much more vigilant and playing a watchdog role. So it's possible that over time, these two laws on the books get strengthened, that regulators get emboldened, and that they do make a difference. So I think the jury is out, but it's clear they haven't made a tremendous difference in global data collection, at least in the last 5 or 6 years since they've been enacted.
The last year, or year and a half really, we've seen AI basically weaponize all sorts of digital do-goodery, but also bad. I don't know what the phrase is. Basically, weaponize hacking of every possible kind across international borders as well. How has that impacted the privacy conversation?
Yeah, it's a great question because all of these AI models are reliant on data to train them and to make them better. And so, actually, the hunger for data in the AI era is only growing. And so, it's a great question. I don't know the answer. I happen to do the bulk of the reporting on this book before anyone had ever heard of ChatGPT, and now everyone knows what it is and everyone's using it. So I think it remains to be seen. And I do think AI, especially in the government context, raises a lot of interesting questions, not just about, killer drones and autonomous weapon systems, which people tend to focus on, but AI would actually make it a lot easier for governments to sort through huge volumes of information at scale and quickly. And it raises all sorts of brand new and interesting privacy questions, right? Like if a computer looks at your information and the computer reviews the information of billions of people and spits out, 100 that it thinks are suspects, has your privacy been violated because a giant computer algorithm, treated you like a suspect, even if it cleared you? Or has your privacy actually been protected because no human being ever laid eyes on your information? It was just a black box. Those are very difficult and interesting philosophical questions about intelligence that I think we're all going to have to answer in the next 5, 10, 15 years.
And, when you say 5, 10, 15 years, I think it'll come as no surprise to our audience that, social mores in a democracy, small d, change. So perhaps it's okay to eat a New York strip steak once a week today, but perhaps in a more enlightened future when we decide that that's bad for all sorts of reasons, this data can, mining this data, you can find out, Rachel, you ate one of those back in 1992 on a regular basis, and we're going to hold you to task for it.
Yeah, and in fact, my book catalogs a lot of the changing social mores, right? And government, in many ways, was responding to social changes, right? So originally, people were not posting a tremendous amount of information about themselves on the early internet. There weren't a lot of terrorists or criminals bragging about their exploits in open forums on the internet in the late 1990s. But as we saw with the rise of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok, the mores around what you share on the internet changed. changed and governments responded to that, right? They decided they were observing that, ISIS was recruiting people on Twitter, and they were sending propaganda videos out in these forums. And so governments felt the need to be in the social conversation. And then as people loaded up their phones with apps and carelessly accepted whatever terms and conditions the app included, and turned on their permissions and let the app collect everything, and large repositories of data became available on hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, governments were there to respond as well, right? And so increasingly, everything's being networked, everything is wireless, everything pings. We all use Bluetooth headphones now instead of these goofy wired ones. And so that is a way to understand the world, and there are ways to collect data about what Bluetooth devices are where. So in many ways, governments are only responding to changing social conditions, changing social norms, changing social mores. And as new data sets become available, governments have moved to take advantage of them for their missions.
So I just want to urge everyone who is thinking of a question that I haven't asked yet that you want to make sure gets in there so Byron can answer it before the end of this hour, to just put those questions into the chat. I'll get to see them and begin to ask them as soon as right now. Here's one question. You state all the data that cards emit and that we agree to share when buying a new car. What happens when I buy a used car? Is data collection illegal at that point if I haven't agreed to it?
So I take it the asker is asking about used cars that are still fairly new that have these data collection abilities, right? Because if you go buy a
Well,
20-year-old
let's
car,
imagine both. Let's imagine both.
right.
Yeah.
So if you go and buy a 20-year-old car, there's probably not a ton of data that's being collected, right? That was before cars were computers on wheels. Even a 10-year-old car, you're probably not going to see a tremendous amount of data collected by the car's central computer. When you're talking about a newish car, 2, 3 years old, you get it used with, 20,000, 30,000 miles. That is a very good question. And it's one I don't really think there is a great answer to. I'm sure somewhere some clever car company lawyers have drawn up some terms of service, or the dealer makes you sign something that says, you accept this car as is, and as is means there's data collection built in. That's possible, but I do think if the legal basis for the collection of a lot of this data is consent, and you have a used car and you didn't sign the paperwork and it came with OnStar already turned on, and who knows where that data is going. That's a very interesting and good question about whether the consumer is truly consenting. I do think we all start to see these annoying pop-ups now on modern cars that say, I agree, and it makes you click I agree before you can even drive the car. I mean, I think basically you're probably agreeing to the data collection by clicking that. But it's a great question, right? Because I don't think we as a society have worked out these questions of, if you buy something used and you haven't agreed to it, is that really consent? That's a great and difficult question that I think is going to come up in a lot of consumer lawsuits over the next few years.
So I guess personal, what do we call it? Personal damage attorneys, might be going after large companies with deep pockets, and maybe getting $5 or $15 for the rest of us. Are we seeing anybody, state attorneys general, perhaps, regulators on the federal level, who are fighting on behalf of the average person?
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned the FTC earlier. I do think they are probably the de facto privacy regulator at this point for the United States, even though they were never really given that mission by Congress. They seem to have taken it upon themselves. They're even doing what's called an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, which is just complicated Washington speak for they're going to try to draw up rules, not short of a law, but rules that would govern lots of data collection issues. I do think there have been some state attorneys general that have been active on this issue, including, especially in sort of sensitive location data, cases. So there, I believe the Massachusetts Attorney General at one point, sued an advertising company because it was collecting data and building audiences around abortion clinics. And, that's a very sensitive topic, especially now with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So a lot of consumer protection agencies or states attorneys general are looking at some of these questions. And in Europe, I think there's a longer tradition of data protection authorities and other agencies sort of taking data a little bit more seriously than we do in the United States. So there certainly are watchdogs out there, there are regulators, and I think increasingly, yes, like plaintiffs' lawyers are also going to be involved here because there are now lots of large companies that are doing things with data that are, shall we say, questionable. Speaking of cars, there was a story in the New York Times today about car companies that were sharing data that people didn't really know they had opted into sharing with insurance companies, and it would measure, how hard you braked and how many times you sped, and then all of a sudden someone would get a giant insurance bill saying, their premium is going up 40%, and they wonder why. And why is because some data broker was collecting all the times they braked hard. One person even, took his Corvette to a racetrack, and where you are allowed to drive faster than the speed limit. But it was possible that the data from that, excursion where he was legally being allowed to put his Corvette through the paces on this track was being used against him because the data broker doesn't know where his car is. It just knows that he's going 125 miles an hour for an hour. And so there really are these very interesting and difficult questions. And I do think you'll increasingly see these plaintiffs' lawyers pop up to try to, some might say make a buck, but others might say to change the privacy calculus for these large companies.
To change the privacy calculus for these large companies. It's interesting you say that because I'm thinking as I'm hearing you talk, maybe a few years ago, I've been at this tech reporting thing for a while now, and I think perhaps I thought somewhat naively a few years ago, like, well, the trend line is going to be that, if Europe or California, has tougher laws, that many of these companies that operate globally or, even just domestically will say it's safer. It's a wiser choice to comply with the tougher consumer privacy law, and then we won't have to worry about anybody coming after us. But I don't think several years on that that's the case. It seems like many companies, big and small, are saying, let's see if anybody comes after us."
I think that's correct, right? You have these laws in California and in Europe, but the reach of American courts or European courts to be able to enforce those laws against companies based in Israel or India or Russia is very limited. And so I think yes, the largest tech players do try to comply with CCPA and GDPR. I do believe these large, giant, enormous tech companies that are household names, I do think they make a good faith effort to comply. But there are tons of these tiny companies that no one's ever heard of that spring up in Singapore or Israel or India that are in a position to collect large amounts of data on the global population and are in a position to also, ignore regulators in jurisdictions like California and Europe because those regulators don't have a tremendous ability to enforce those laws outside of their borders. And so it's a great question. And the way that our data ecosystem is set up is that it's truly global with the flows, but enforcement is local and dependent on if you can actually get that person in a courthouse before you and collect on a judgment against them. And in many cases, that would be very difficult.
And even though it may seem like there's armies of tech reporters carefully watching all US government agencies, we might be more inclined to look at how those agencies are interrelating with big companies like Google and Apple, and not so much the fly-by-night.coms of the world.
That's right. I mean, there's been tons of attention on, Google's artificial intelligence program with the Pentagon, but there has not been a tremendous amount of journalistic or civil society attention on these relationships that these very small data brokers in the Virginia area or the suburbs of Maryland have with U.S. government entities. But that is honestly where the data of billions of people is passing from corporations that no one's ever heard of to contractors that no one's ever heard of to government agencies. And, I find that that's a serious, issue and a potential threat to the civil liberties and privacy of people using technology. And at the very least is a phenomenon that I think is very worthy of exploring. And that's what I hope to have done in this book.
One of the things you do in this book, and I'm sure this will be very interesting to our audience members, you include an appendix that offers basically an ordinary person's guide to digital privacy, a how-to guide for people who want to protect their data. And sure enough, we've got a question from the audience. Is there anything you suggest we do to protect our privacy from these data brokers? If you could name one thing, what would it be?
One thing,
One
pay
thing.
money. One
Pay
thing I
money.
would say, pay
Use
money.
cash?
Uh, no, what I mean is that
Yeah.
the entire model that I'm describing here is a world in which consumers are very reluctant to pay money for services and apps on the web. And so as a result, this alternative business model has sprung up where the payment is your data. I'm sorry to say there is no free, right? It does take
But I'm
money.
going to challenge you here. If I
Yeah.
subscribe to, say, the Wall Street Journal, aren't they still collecting my data and selling it on?
I think the Wall Street Journal is collecting some of your data as first-party information. I don't think they're entirely relying on selling off your data to consumer data brokers as their source of revenue. And in fact, if, they really were tracking your location around, or they were, really invasively making your data available or your reading habits available for sale, I think they would risk losing your trust as a consumer, or at least certain segment of their readership's trust. And so the Wall Street Journal has a business to business relationship with, or sorry, a consumer to business relationship with people. They're a global brand. I would say they're probably not monetizing their customers in the same way that a free game that's just trying to get you to say yes and accept the location tracking is really exploiting their user base for their entire source of revenue. It's the same with Google in its original incarnations. Now, I think Google sells a lot more hardware and does, have paid enterprise customers, but in the early days, it was really free, but free, the cost of it was your data. And so, I do think that at the heart of this is this business model where people are unwilling to pay, a few bucks a month for a service, even though that service, takes money to code an app. You have to pay coders, you have to hire a lawyer, you have to rent server space. None of that's free. And so if we could return more towards the basic bargain of, hey, you're giving me something of value, I'm giving you a few dollars, it would be a healthier ecosystem. It wouldn't solve every problem overnight, but I do think at the root of all of this data collection is somewhat this consumer reluctance to pay money for things on the internet.
Although I got to believe, even if you start to pay for some things, there's going to be untold thousands of state actors, small companies that are continue to participate in this industry because it is so lucrative.
Yes, and so the most complicated part of this book that is hard to even explain in kind of a casual setting like this, but is the advertising ecosystem, right? And basically, these targeted display ads on your phone are in this position to collect data about your device, even if you don't know that, right? It's even if you're loading the Weather Channel app or some game, the little banner ad is actually passing a lot of information about you back to this server, and on that server are tens of thousands of these entities that are in a position to collect large amounts of data. And that's not going to go away so long as there's banner advertising and so long as these advertisers that run these servers don't do very much due diligence on all the companies they let sit on this server, because tens of thousands of parties are getting information from billions of phones. And given how much information we're talking about here, yes, of course, governments are going to lurk around there. Criminals, cyber, ransomware gangs, they're all going to try to find ways to get on this network and extract data from it.
Just want to remind our listeners again, we have just a few more minutes left before the end of the hour. So if you have a burning question for Byron, now is the time to type it into the chat box on YouTube. So Byron, here's a really great audience question. You mentioned you wrote this book before the explosion of AI and ChatGPT. If you could add additional chapters or examples to your book now, what would they be and why?
I think it's really early in the AI revolution to understand exactly what governments are doing with it. In fact, I think the last line of the book before the outro is this contractor who had been very open about talking to me for the book. And, you know, he talked to me about this location tracking tool he built for the Pentagon that took advantage of these display ads that I was talking about. And at one point, you know, in our relationship, I asked, you know, what is next? And he laughed and he basically said, that's, you know, that's for me to, you're going to have to find that out 5 years down the line. And by the time you do find out, I'll be on to the next thing and you're going to have to find that out. Right. So I think we're at this point with AI that I don't even think we understand even the commercial possibilities for it, much less the surveillance implications. You know, I do think adding large amounts of information to these black box algorithms, there probably will be very interesting ways to exploit what people are typing into them and, you know, potentially tracing that information back to someone. Of course, potentially you could manipulate the output of AI, right? Like I'm not a coder, but recently I've discovered that ChatGPT will write basic Python code for me or will help me use the command line in a way that I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm trusting that this computer system is telling me the right thing. Well, if you're an intelligence agency, wouldn't it be convenient if you could insert some code into some dummy like me who doesn't know what the code means, and then you could get some sort of information from a device? So there are all sorts of very interesting possibilities that I think will be clearer in 5 or 10 years, but are not very clear right now.
You know, we've seen in recent years such an explosion in, um, I'm trying to think, misinformation and disinformation on social media, people selling drugs, people, attacking or young people and engaging them in what often turns out to be sex trade, and just a lot of bad behavior. But I'm wondering if as you were researching this book, you could imagine a world in which knowing that we're being surveilled so heavily would lead to a chilling effect, would lead people to curb bad behavior because they're like, oh, I could be tracked. I could be tracked for anything.
Yeah, it's a great question. Certainly, I think the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade was a moment where lots of people who, didn't really consider themselves criminals, they by and large considered themselves responsible citizens, but maybe they live in a state where abortion is illegal. Maybe in the future, that state will make even traveling out of state a crime, and they really sort of viscerally understood the consequences of data collection in a way they potentially didn't before. And then, you talked about social media. We haven't talked a ton about it, but I do spend almost a quarter of my book talking about government efforts to monitor social media. And I think that's a very thorny question, right? I don't think the answer is that government should just never be in these social spaces, because, we've seen instances where people brag about crimes on social media. A lot of the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol was streamed on social media. So I don't think it's a very satisfying answer to just say this: the government can never look at social media. But these government entities do find themselves in a very tricky position, right? Because if they surveil social media too heavily, then of course there's this chilling effect that people might feel that the government power has gone too far, that they're constantly under being watched, that they can't organize and speak and plan a lawful demonstration in a way that that doesn't draw law enforcement's notice. But on the other hand, if they are throwing bricks through storefronts or storming the U.S. Capitol, then you are talking about crime. So it's extremely difficult to get that balance right. And I think states are really struggling with that in all the domains that I'm writing about. Is like, where do we want people to solve, we want crimes to be solved. We do want, a secure country, but we also don't want government power and authority to become too overbearing. And, I think we as democracies are really struggling imperfectly with these very difficult questions.
Is there any behavior that you've changed on your part after all of this research?
Yeah, I'm very careful. I'm a journalist, so this maybe just applies to me, but I tend to be very, very careful about my communications and about my movements, right? Because I do meet with sources. I mean, usually, even though I cover national security, usually they're not telling me anything super classified, but I don't want it to be publicly known where I'm going and who I'm meeting with. And I do want to protect my notes. I want to protect the people who speak to me, potentially from civil litigation, right? Because, sometimes they're violating NDAs to talk to me. So I'm extremely cautious about, communicating in channels that I consider secure, insisting that the messages disappear, and basically controlling my own data, right? So I don't put a ton in the cloud unless I'm really the only person that has access to it. And I do take precautions like using end-to-end encrypted apps and end-to-end encrypted email and storing things locally or in an encrypted cloud environment whenever I can.
Ah, but you mentioned encryption, and that makes me just think about the back doors that many governments require of tech makers.
Yeah, and I think it's actually, I take a different perspective, right? Because if you think historically, people were not generally speaking giving their documents to third parties 30, 40 years ago. So what I think is encryption essentially, if we're going to use the cloud, right? If we're going to communicate and speak to in online, encryption returns the balance of power to people, right? So if, in the old days we put our important documents in a safe or, in a physical environment, and if the police wanted them, they had to come to your physical environment. They could come with a search warrant if they thought you were involved in criminal activity, but they couldn't just go to some company, and demand that they get your documents. But that is essentially the circumstance we have with our cell phone carriers, with Google, with all these email service providers, that we've entrusted them with our information. And whenever the government wants information from you, they actually go to them most of the time. They don't come to you. They don't take your computer anymore. You don't see these raids where FBI agents are walking out of buildings carrying computers and laptops. No, they send a request to Google and Google hands over your data.
Right. Well, along those lines, somebody asked, given how many years you've been researching in this field, was there anything, any point or anything during your research for this book that struck you as particularly surprising or shocking?
The one thing that people really remember from reading this book is car tires. So car tires are a potential way of tracking a car, because when you turn on your car and you flip through that little menu and it shows the tire pressure of each one of your tires. Well, the way the car's computer knows that is because there's this little wireless sensor or in the inside the tire, and it just pings the central computer of your car wirelessly. But it says something like, I'm a Ford tire and my identifier is 123Z2 and my tire pressure is 42 psi. All's good. But clever government intelligence agencies have realized that these signals are proxies for the car. And so, there's these experiments to do, see if we can put up sensors places and track cars this way, or, look at anomalies. If a license plate was this yesterday and the car tires were this, and suddenly the plate switches, well, now you have some interesting information. So, a couple of intelligence officers kept talking about car tires, and I didn't understand. It took me a long time to figure out what the heck they were talking about. And, it's not a vector that people think of when they're trying to avoid surveillance, but no, like, this is how everything in modern life is. Bluetooth headphones are the same way. There are these weird government projects out there that were trying to put code in millions of phones scattered around the world that were monitoring the signal environment around the phone for either the cell towers of where the phone was and to map that out, or the Wi-Fi base stations, or in some cases, Bluetooth devices. So this weird world of wireless signals is something that I think is very poorly understood, and that governments have moved towards seeing what they can collect at scale using random ordinary people who accidentally put some cell phone app on their phone. So it's just a strange, wild world of data that you can collect if you're clever enough and you have access to millions of devices around the world. And the reality is, it's actually not that hard to get access to a few million devices, just because of the sheer amount of software we all put on our phones and the number of people that have phones.
So and I guess I'm kind of sort of coming at the same thing that we began this conversation with. Given that so many people have access to so much of your data, um, why wouldn't we want U.S. government agencies to have access to it too, so that they could, see where there's a drug addiction problem in America today, or see who's planning a 9/11 style attack? Shouldn't we indeed expect our government regulators to be keeping an eagle eye in the same way that other actors are?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's reasonable that potentially the social norms are changing, but they need to change overtly. And in a lot of the reporting that I did in this book, government entities and data brokers did not want to talk about what they were doing with data. And to some degree, that's understandable, right? Because they're worried that people will change their behavior, will ditch their phones, or won't use certain services if, a nosy journalist like me writes about it. But I don't think that's really how it should work in a democracy, right? Like if we as a democratic society and as consumers who buy technology from these companies, honestly, we really should understand what our government is doing with technology and what our technology companies are doing with our data. And I don't feel that it's right to keep the public in the dark about how some of this stuff works and what governments are doing with it. Of course, sometimes governments need to keep secrets, right? Like, of course, we don't splay the name of every person that's spying for the United States and Russia. We don't do that. But just at the basic level, I think we do insist in criminal law enforcement and increasingly in intelligence that people understand these programs, right? They understand what they're signing up for. They understand how police work. Police are required to put evidence in the public record in most criminal trials. The data broker world I found was the opposite, right? They wanted it cloaked in secrecy. There was something a Maryland police sergeant said in an email that was obtained by a EFF, I believe, about a location tracking tool. And what he said was, success lies in the secrecy, meaning that he didn't want people to understand what he was doing. And what he was doing was warrantlessly tracking people, right? Not specific criminals that he had gone and gotten a warrant for because he thought they were criminals. This was everyone. And so, I do really believe that in an open society, people should understand what their government is up to and what their technology does.
It does seem like the framers of our Constitution, the framers of our constitutional amendments envisioned a society where the individual had wide berth to privacy. And that over the course of the last 30 years has just been, I don't know, flushed down the toilet. I guess my next question for you is, how well are you sleeping at night, Byron? Do you feel like this is just going in a very bad direction and there's no coming back from it?
I actually, I certainly have gone through periods, of course, doing this reporting where I've seesawed into what some people around me might call paranoid. And then I've gone in the other direction, right? I've got a smartwatch on, I've got a fitness ring that tracks my sleep, and I really do get benefits from these things. So it is a matter of using technology mindfully and trying to understand what it does. And so, there are certain things that I do accept in the modern world, right? Like, okay, they might track my Bluetooth headphones. Great. Okay, some spy agency, foreign government might get my sleep data. Oh, okay. I do get a benefit from having a fitness tracker or having a certain software on my phone. So, I increasingly do think that even the younger generation, which is notoriously dismissed as not caring about privacy, and I just don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, they are addicted to their smartphones like the rest of us, but I think they understand how to make choices about what to share and when. I think they understand closed social media networks versus open ones, and I do think there is increasingly a lot of consumer awareness and concern about some of this stuff, but people feel hopeless. It's a complicated topic and they don't quite know how to take back control. And, my book isn't a how-to guide, it's more of a story, but I do hope to help people understand a little bit more the world we're living in and what we are potentially moving to, and help them take action if they feel that this is not what they've chosen.
It's interesting as you talk about young people. I mean, I think in a way, younger generations have grown up in a world where the presumption of privacy doesn't exist anymore. Like you think about the ways, and if you want someone to feel close to you, you say, "Hey, I'm gonna share my location with you." And there are different gradations of it. So they might know the different functions of, the phone, how to be quite specific about what information you share. But there's a different kind of presumption of no privacy compared, I think, to some older generations. And it makes me wonder, do you think you're going to have a lot of younger readers of this book? Or are they fleeing into a different kind of future than the one that you or I might be comfortable with?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, I do think a lot of these, I think a lot of the young adults that are coming of age now have grown up in a world in which, social media could visit a lot of consequences on you if you said the wrong thing, right? So a lot of them actually are a little bit private on, maybe not all of them, but some of them, right? Or they're trying to become an influencer, but they're doing it mindfully. So I do think there is some understanding of privacy, but yes, I think the social norms among this generation are wildly different, right? They grew up sharing their location with their parents on Life 360, and that strikes older generations as invasive and maybe a little crazy. And uh, so, yeah, the social norms have certainly changed. Some things are never going to go back in the bottle. But I do think there is some increasing understanding of the trade-offs of these technologies and some pushback from consumers in some quarters on too much data collection.
Well, Byron, this has just been a fascinating conversation. I'm not sure how well I'm going to sleep tonight, but no, I mean, you've brought up some really important points. I want to thank you, Byron Tao, author of Means of Control: How the Hidden Alliance of Tech and Government is Creating a New American Surveillance State. And we encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Byron's new book at your local bookstore, maybe even in person, maybe even in cash. If you'd like to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit commonwealthclub.org/events. I'm Rachel Myrow. Thank you and take care.